The RotoViz Overtime Mailbag Edition. That's what we're going to call this show, Shawn. I was trying to think of a name to call it for the intro. We got a couple of shows over the last week where we talked about the quarterbacks, the running backs, the tight ends, and the wide receivers, what our thoughts were on certain players that were kind of in a middle ground, or maybe they had a huge amount of success this year or no success, and where we were changing our expectations from, say, 2024's offseason to the 2025 offseason. We did get a lot of feedback, particularly on the YouTube comment section with certain players that people were interested in our thoughts on. So that is what we're going to do as we run through some of those on today's show. So it's a variety of positions, a variety of kind of age profiles, player profiles, and we're going to talk about as many of them as we can fit in here as we record. And a highlight to you that, we get a lot of great stuff over the off season. This is a perfect time for people to send in their questions or topics, what they would like to hear discussed on the show, whether that's the players like we're going to do today, or whether it's, your dynasty roster, what you could do, or maybe a strategy that we talk about on the show. You can send them my way on Twitter or on Blue Sky at Overtime Ireland, or you can email them across at rotovizradio@gmail.com, and we'll use the best ones as we work through the off-season process. Another shout out for the promo code for RV Radio. If you're getting a 10% discount off a RotoViz NFL pass, you can use code RVRadio2025. That is now updated to 2025 versus 2024. So if you are looking for 10% off, use that code, get access to all of the content and tools, the rankings, and so on up on rotoviz.com. Once again, that's RV Radio 2025. Shawn, we are going to kick this one off with a player who is interesting because he had quite a number of highlight plays. We talked a little bit about the offense being pretty much moonballs to George Pickens for the Pittsburgh Steelers, where it would be unsuccessful play. Let's just go to George Pickens. Let's see if we can draw a flag or if he can make an incredible dive and catch. But then there is the moments where you're like, what's the effort level with George Pickens? What's going through George Pickens' mind? How are we moving forward here with the quarterback situation? So Patrick Russell messaged in with George Pickens as the player that he was interested in on our 2025 thoughts or rankings, or where we were placing our expectations on him as we head towards the offseason and into next season. He's a player that I don't have rostered on any dynasty leagues currently. Wasn't really in on him at all entering last season. What's your thoughts, and should I be changing my stance here on George Pickens as we enter 2025 and he'll enter his age 24 season?
Pickens so controversial because you get those big plays. He has some of the best hands in all of football. He's one of only a handful of guys where if you get the ball up to him deep down the sidelines, he can bring it in. He has the full constellation of skills that you need, whether it be the importance of late hands when the defense is prepared, whether it's the ability to rise up and simply elevate above the defensive back so you get clear, if it's holding the ball through contact, if it's getting the feet down in bounds, being able to navigate the balance. You have this balletic ability down there at the edges, which it's so difficult. We see very good players step out of bounds on even routine plays. There was a play in the AFC Championship game that wasn't even that difficult of a play where Hollywood Brown has a back shoulder, ends up getting open. It's a key 3rd and long. The pass is there. He both drops it and has a foot out of bounds, right? So you didn't execute any of the elements of the play that were necessary. The flip side of that is that Pickens is probably not one of these guys who is going to get open at will and be that intermediate run after the catch type of player. Now, having said that, his evasion rate jumped quite a bit this last year. He broke some more tackles. You did see some dynamism with the ball in his hands that maybe you hadn't gotten previously. But the other problem that you bring in there is when you're a little bit one-dimensional, even if that dimension is extremely valuable in the contemporary NFL, but then you add on quarterback concerns. We didn't want any part of him coming into 2024, in part because the big plays down the stretch of the 2023 season really changed how people saw him, and you want to view the season from the whole. So he's going to be overvalued almost for sure, but then you introduce this quarterback controversy, two different quarterbacks in Justin Fields, one who's probably not going to elevate the receiver, although again, DJ Moore and Colm had very good receiving seasons with him in 2023. Russell Wilson, someone who was so bad the previous year with the Broncos that they had gone to only running the ball. You think about the difference with Jerry Jeudy being able to get out away from Russell Wilson, and suddenly he now looks like certainly one of the best 20 receivers in the NFL, if not someone who's pushing at the edge of the top 10. We did have some moments where that connection looked a lot better than we were anticipating. You also had this general level of play from Wilson going down the stretch to where he probably is not going to be an NFL starter in the future. It doesn't seem like, in terms of what we're hearing out of Pittsburgh right now, that he will be the Steelers starter. We don't know who that guy will be. It's probably going to be difficult to get a player in there who really does it. Now, I think that you could argue that it doesn't take someone that good. I mean, we saw Mason Rudolph, and again, Mason Rudolph is half decent, right? He was a lot better than Will Levis when you think about where the Titans were this season. But I think a lot of Pickens managers are going to be thinking, if we could just get that level of play, then you have such a dynamic receiver that you want him on your roster. You're going to plug him into your starting lineups. All of that is more or less a no-brainer. I think because the outlook going forward with Pickens in the short term is not good, but in the medium term could be significantly better, and the long term could still be fantastic. I think the little bit of an issue that you're dealing with Pickens is that you have all of this talent, but if you're pushing it back, if you're pushing this timeline into the future, even for a young player, we always talk about, you don't really want to hold them through that time where the value perhaps falls, but even more someone with Pickens who has big concerns about football character. We don't know about his character in general. I've read lots of things about him that make him seem like a really interesting, cool individual. But from a football character perspective, red flags fly up all the time. That type of commitment to team could torpedo someone. We've certainly seen plenty of receivers in the past where their career goes down a path that we weren't expecting because of attitude. And so if you have that risk involved and you're kind of looking past the short term, you're starting to layer in multiple types of risks at this point that make it tricky. But again, the talent is there, the ability to make those plays on the sidelines, those are pretty rare.
Yeah, he has the ability and the talent that you mentioned. The part that is interesting is he's 23 now, he would be 24 before the start of next season. And if you are looking at, moving it to a year or two down the road before you have a quarterback that's in there and everything comes together for him, trying to move him on then is going to be that little bit tricky. The other part that I think is tricky, Shawn, is I think there's enough highlight plays over the course of the last, especially the 2024 season, and people will say, like, well, if a better quarterback's in, look at how much better he could be. I think there's enough in that it's not really a player that you're going to get a discount on, even though I think there's reasons why there should be discounts around the entire package that we're discussing there. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky for me in buying into him in Dynasty. It'll be interesting to see where the ADP sits when we get to draft season and it kind of settles into a spot. I have two veterans, Shawn, that came in terms of the question for the next one, came in from Shane Depot. He's looking about Alvin Kamara, Deebo Samuel. He said, what do you think about those guys? He said, when is the floor going to fall out from under us with Kamara, and is Deebo worth buying low on after an awful season? These are both guys obviously in the veteran category. Deebo is going to be 30 before the start of next season. Similarly with Alvin Kamara. Kamara obviously in PPR leagues has always had that kind of floor. The floor at a point this year felt like maybe it was falling out, but what's your thoughts on Kamara and Deebo? And obviously, when you're looking at this from a dynasty perspective, they're very, very tough players to want to add to a roster in the way that we're trying to construct them, with like a perpetual reload, keeping that window open for as many years as possible. When the floor falls out of these players, the value is gone. So they're kind of players probably you wanted to be moving on from 12 months ago, at least, with Samuel, but even further back, maybe with an Alvin Kamara. What are you thinking here? Is there any reason that you would add either guy to a dynasty roster moving forward? And then I think that kind of will also answer our kind of view ahead in next season. I feel like these are both players that should be in that kind of 9-10 range in terms of ADP for the 2025 season.
Yeah, when you're looking at Kamara, you're looking at someone who just has terrible rushing peripherals. Now, that has taken place or been the case for a while. And so it doesn't guarantee that he won't have value in 2025. One of the things that has happened with the Saints is they continue to paint themselves into a really bleak corner. And it's been one of the issues that they've had as they search for a coach, is you have
I think that's a historical issue, Shawn. Now at this point, it's like, they're going to continue to have cap issues and kick the can down the road forever.
And you can do it to an extent, right? And you can do it with creative accounting, but you also... And I didn't
even mention that Kamara got extended during this season. Like, if you're trying to put a positive into the category.
Right. Sean Payton saw the writing on the wall, and he's like, I need to get out of the NFL for a year. I need to come back with a team where I can start from scratch and build up a second dynasty. It's simply not going to work with the Saints. Now, some of that, again, I think actually does insulate Kamara quite a bit. I think you want to look at the coaching situation there as that evolves. I think you want to be aware of all of the movement in free agency. That's going to be the case for basically all of the players that you are evaluating. But I do think we're in this weird situation with Kendre Miller busting from an availability perspective. At this point, there seems to be a lot of reason to believe that what the Saints have seen from him on the field is that he's really good, but that everything else is so problematic that it doesn't matter. Anytime that you have a player like Kamara who has that receiving ability, you want to be aware of when you could get him out of value. So I think there's a chance for him to have yet another season where he surprises to the positive in terms of what his contributions are. Certainly coming off of a season this big, I didn't anticipate that. But yeah, you have to look at the most recent season when you're thinking through what's most likely for the next year. Having said that, a path like the Austin Eckler path, I mean, it's almost inevitable. We've seen it so many times. That fits what he could do and where he probably works best to help a team. Eckler still made some big plays this season, and the flexibility that he brought was helpful to the Commanders, even though he's a niche piece. The other element that we have to mention as we consider any of these running backs right now, because you have two different things going on simultaneously. You have this resurgence, this renaissance for the running back position, where specific teams have figured out how to unlock some big plays. And then you're getting a lot of short yardage touchdowns. You're getting a lot of volume to the lead backs because of the way teams are playing and giving that value away schematically on defense. At the same time, you're coming off of a season where starting running backs were historically healthy, and that part is going to be very fluky, right? So we're going to have a mindset in general simply because we always overlearn the previous lesson or take the lessons from the previous season too seriously. Running backs are likely to be a little bit overpriced, but then the dynamic that goes with that is that right now, and we're still very early on in the process, we may discover that a lot of these guys aren't as athletic as we would like. We may discover that a lot of these guys go to backfields that just become very congested and it destroys some of the fantasy value. But that's kind of part and parcel of what we're looking at here, which is that this running back class is the polar opposite of the 2024 running back class. And even in that case, where you don't have good prospects and you lose the probably best prospect in Brooks to yet another injury, you have guys like Bucky Irving, Tyrone Tracy push through, really take the lead even without an injury to another guy. We're going to see that across the entire NFL this next year. There are so many good prospects in this draft, to the extent that, just off the top of my head, having kind of done the prospect evaluation for going on 15 years now, and how that evaluation works obviously has evolved through that time. But you think back to kind of the birth of RotoViz, the things that we were doing there, where we are. And I don't remember a class quite this loaded. Colm, I had an interesting piece on the site during the season ranking the last 10 classes sort of overall, not just running back, obviously. Anyone who's interested in looking at that and seeing how well my rankings of those players, specifically the younger players mid-season, how well that's aged, you can find that there. It's a fun one, if nothing else. But I do go into quite a lot of detail with those classes. That influx of running back talent is going to completely change the running back landscape. And that's another thing that happened last year, right? Is you have all these starting running backs stay healthy, and you had very little push from rookies because you didn't have much rookie talent. And some of the teams that probably hit on their rookies were teams like the Jets, where they put 2 good guys behind Breece Hall, even though they had all these other needs. So I think you've got to be very aware of how running back is going to be a completely different position in 2025 when you're starting to plot your strategy for this season across all formats.
The other player I mentioned was Deebo. Any thoughts on him?
It looks like a Cliff situation, doesn't it? It
looks like something that if you are trying to acquire him, you're not going to get him for like a bargain basement price, and you're taking on all the rest at that point.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the prices may get pretty low at some different points here. The collapse in his numbers, 2023 to 2024, are really pretty extraordinary. Yeah. You look at Deebo, 2.5 yards per route in the way that SIS assigns the routes in 2023, down to 1.7 this most recent season. The drop rate jumps up. He's always had a bit of a problem with that. The evasion rate craters, and specifically with someone like Deebo Samuel, that's crucially important because that's what he does when he catches the short passes, and then you can't bring him down. And he had this insane 40% evasion rate on 89 targets. So very meaningful volume in 2023. That falls off a cliff. His ADOT continues to drop. You're not seeing the vertical component, even with all of the injuries they had. One of the things that we talked about preseason is that if you get that Ayuk injury, then it frees Samuel up to do some of the things. Now, not exclusively. You got some other guys there as well. And obviously, Jawan Jennings was the revelation for the 49ers this season. But you had all of these different scenarios that could work out where Deebo Samuel pushes his way back into the top 5. To have gone so far in the other direction, despite the opportunity that was there. And the 49ers are always a team where there's so much value and their players are good enough that I think you want to buy them when they're down. We've had a ton of success with that through the last 4 or 5 years. Deebo Samuel is so good. I think you've got to sprinkle that in if you're talking about best ball, if you're talking about redraft. If you can get someone to take him in Dynasty at a price where you do get something reasonable back, even if you lose and he does bounce back, you have done some things for your team that probably help you in the long run.
We mentioned the running back scenario. You hyped up the class. The next player here, Shawn, did come in last year's class, had, I thought, really good start to his time with the Giants, and then it kind of fizzed out at times towards the end. That was Tyrone Tracy. He became the lead back in a really struggling offense. Obviously, there was quarterback issues. There was lots of change in landscape. Obviously, the wide receiver and Malik Neighbors came out with his head held very, very high on the end of his rookie season. But you kind of made the picture there of what this class could be like, which means some of these teams are going to have to draft rookie running backs, which will bring competition in some of those environments. Devin Singletary was there this past season. We'll see what they do with building out this backfield. But is Tracy someone who you think did show enough obviously there was a lot of it through the receiving game. Did he show enough as an early down running back that he could have a substantial role moving forward? Or maybe even, is it a case that the receiving work that he showed based on playing in PPR formats, is that enough for him, if he's in that receiving role, to be a substantial fantasy asset?
I think so. You consider where he is in his career trajectory. Now, this is an older player, a very old rookie. You want to keep that in mind. And yet, for running backs, we're still basically always talking about very small windows and looking at the most recent season as being the one that is going to give us the most information about what they're likely to do this next year, unless you're talking
Shawn,
about a guy.
When you say an old rookie, he turned 25 in November. Very old.
Yeah. I mean, this is a different situation.
A veteran rookie.
Right. A veteran rookie. But his numbers, his final season in college really jumped off the page to where if he had been a young back, then I think you would have had to consider him in that sort of Jonathan Brooks category. It is apples and oranges. But if you're looking at something that is an apple, maybe if you prefer oranges or vice versa, you want that apple to at least be the very best version of an apple that you could possibly get. And he was that as a prospect. And then he did a lot of really positive things as a runner in that rookie season with the Giants. 2.7 yards after contact per attempt. That's not a huge number, but it's a very solid number, again, especially within the context of this offense. 4.5 or 4.4 yards per carry. That's a fantastic number, again, when you adjust for the context. I mean, you think about what Saquon Barkley was doing in this offense that doesn't block and that doesn't create pressure on the defense through their passing game. A little over 16 in terms of the evasion rate. That's not elite, but it's right in that range where you look at that and there's a lot of potential. You watch him run and you can see the dynamism. They liked Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary is probably a little bit underrated back. And for Tyrone Tracy to completely take that job, other than when he was hurt and other than when he was fumbling incessantly, the fact that they were still willing to go back to him after those fumbles is a positive sign, again, in terms of what their evaluation of his talent is. You look at the Giants, they're embarrassed by that situation with losing Barkley and having him go and have it this epic season. But they're also a team that has so many needs that if you have a running back who is above average athletically and that is a hybrid back, the other thing that Tracy brings, and I always like to mention that some of these guys who transition from receiver, they've done so because they actually are not very good receivers. Now, there's a different element when you're saying a not very good receiver where they have all of these route responsibilities versus a running back who is expected to more or less, flare out, catch the ball, and run forward. But he looked good in that area. If you have the hybrid profile, you're above average athletically, you impress as a rookie. I mean, this is the launch point for him, but it's going to be so tempting for all of these teams to add a back on day 3 who still has starter traits. So Tracy's situation is not that he couldn't really take off from here, but that when you are a mid-round pick, you do have some struggles as a rookie. You have those elements to your profile where you're already old, basically, when you started your NFL experience, specifically at the running back position. Then the moat that you have is very narrow. It's a problem that we run into across the running back position, but certainly guys like a Barkley, like a Jahmyr Gibbs, like an Achane, even someone like a Jonathan Taylor who went through multiple down seasons and really was down for the first 2/3 of this year before he starts to break off those long runs. Those types of guys, there's so much moat that you're safe. Now, again, people are going to know that. It's not like that's secret information, but as we think through the scenarios that can happen to all of these other backs, there's just no protection for someone who doesn't really profile as a superstar.
Yeah, and the other thing that we kind of hinted at, that very important with these rookies, whether it's the running back or wide receiver positions, to factor in the time in college, but also their age. We talk a lot about Bucky Irving in the show, and he's going to be a lot harder to acquire at the moment than Tyrone Tracy, but there's a full 3 years between those two rookies in terms of their actual age, which is kind of shocking when you think through it. But just if you're going out, somebody like Tracy feels like could be a bargain to pick up on heading into the second season, has a real breakout as the complete starting running back for the Giants. But then you're into his age 26 season, and moving on from him then is very, very tricky in terms of getting the value and continuing to build that roster. Shawn, for tight end premium and just tight end in general, a player who is kind of interesting as he approaches the end of his rookie contract, 1 year left on that with the Baltimore Ravens, is Isaiah Likely. We have seen flashes at different times from him. We've seen Mark Andrews, kind of still have some tight end premium upside, but falling away in this season since his injury last season. What are you thinking here with Likely as a potential, not even necessarily somebody and he could be somebody who steps in and takes that tight end one role for the Baltimore Ravens on a permanent basis, but let's say goes into free agency a year from now. Do you think he's somebody that people should be trying to acquire with an outlook to the 2025 season, but also beyond?
Yeah, he would be one of those players that you try to add in on the underside of a trade. So if you're doing a 2 for 2, a 3 for 2, you're trying to figure out how to balance out values. He's very interesting, right? He had more yards after the catch last season than Mark Andrews, even though he drew 11 fewer targets, 15 fewer catchable targets. He's not necessarily that far away from Andrews in terms of some of the on the field availability. SIS has them 49 routes apart. We know that Mark Andrews had the really big touchdown season, but Likely also scored 6 touchdowns. You have this potential touchdown flukiness that could go in your favor. And based on what we saw from Andrews, which was a lack of dynamism in 2024, the lack of sort of intentionality with which the Ravens used him. He was no longer an offensive focal point. And then you had him playing very successfully off of these other pieces, off of what they were able to do with Derrick Henry, off of the scrambling ability and that just downhill running of Lamar Jackson once he gets to the edge, off of Zay Flowers, off of the vertical threat that Rashad Bateman became this year. But you didn't get dynamism from him specifically other than saying, yeah, when he was wide open in the end zone, he caught those touchdowns. Now, it's very easy to overlook the value of those types of players. Colm, we think about some other sports in basketball, for example. And I specifically think of college basketball. That's the one that I enjoy. I'm sort of a college basketball, pro football guy and not vice versa as much. Obviously, both sports are great across all levels. But you'll have these players who are a bit frustrating because they seem like they're playing below either their expected level, their normal level, what have you. Their box score looks fine, but when you watch them, they're not doing the things you had hoped. But again, the box score is fine. There are a lot of sort of quiet points that if you take that guy out, you simply don't get those points, even if it seems like he's underperforming what he could do. The 11 touchdowns for Mark Andrews aren't exactly quiet, but if you don't have that player, it's not that simple to say, oh, it just would have gone to somebody else doing the same thing. If he were a difference maker, he'd be catching more passes. That's probably not really true, right? But having said that, Likely is someone who, right from week 1, where he had the massive eruption and then through into even the playoffs, where you can see what he does and how he could be a chess piece in the contemporary NFL, especially. And then, Colm, we talked a little bit about the prospect research. As I go back through and I'm looking at tight ends, I'm writing up the new guys, it always jumps out to me that Likely in his season at Coastal Carolina before he entered the NFL. Now, again, it's at a small school. It's at a guy who is kind of, borderline, is he even a tight end? But massive numbers. I mean, this is not someone who a team is kind of making him based on, okay, the Ravens are good. If you have a chess piece, if you have an athletic guy, you're going to be able to go and do some things here. You're talking about someone whose collegiate performance was in that same basic category that we think about for Trey McBride, right? And we all know, how we see him. Isaiah Likely is not Trey McBride, but there are things here and things that he has done now at multiple levels where if you're looking for a sleeper, if you're looking for a second half of his career, we think about these tight ends who do emerge kind of in the second half, their late 20s or early 30s. likely is pretty interesting. I think you have to approach it with the idea, though, that startability and immediate production is going to be frustrating.
So we'll keep tabs on Likely as we move forward here. I do think that he is somebody who's very interesting with the look ahead, and also kind of you painted the picture there. You know, if there's any regression from Andrews, or maybe the team pushes on in the direction, maybe they re-sign him to a contract this offseason, which means that he's going to be there beyond next season. Likely, I think, could become a really key part, particularly in tight end premium, because if he can consolidate some of that volume, get some more times in the end zone, I think there's an interesting piece there. But I do think that he could be, he's kind of on that list of tight ends who has a chance to make a leap into the next tier, but also maybe acquirable at cost. But we are going to leave it there. We do thank people for giving the suggestions of the names that they would like to hear us talk about. Feel free to share them with me on social media at Overtime Ireland, or emailed across at rotovizradio@gmail.com. We'll try and pop some of those onto some upcoming shows. You can always find Shawn's work on rotoviz.com. But that's where we're going to leave it for this edition of RotoViz Overtime. Until we are back, have a good one.